Hey friends, welcome back to Medieval Historian, or welcome for the first time. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most heartbreaking and brutal corner of history. This video is about the orphans of medieval times, children who lost their families and lost almost every chance at safety, dignity, and survival. No fairy tale endings here, just starvation, slavery, and suffering in the shadows of castles and cathedrals. Think it's hard growing up without parents today? Imagine being 6 years old, alone, in a world with no social services, no orphanages like we know them, no education, no laws protecting you, and not a single adult who actually cares if you live or die. Today, even the harshest systems have rules. Back then, the only rule was, you don't matter unless someone owns you. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, but not too cozy, because tonight's story will not let you rest easy. This is why orphans suffered most in medieval times. In the medieval world, being born was already a gamble. Half the children never made it past their 5th birthday, and those who did were often one bad winter, one hungry rat, or one angry noble away from the grave. But if you were born and then left alone, if you lost your parents to plague, war, childbirth, famine, or just the cruel randomness of medieval life, then you weren't just at the mercy of fate. You were marked. A child without parents wasn't seen as vulnerable or sacred or in need of protection. You were a burden, a mouth to feed, a problem someone else hoped would go away. There were no systems waiting to catch you, no adoption agencies, no foster care, no social workers asking if you were doing okay. What you had was luck, cold, hard, impersonal luck. And for most orphans, that luck ran out fast. If your village was feeling generous, someone might let you sleep in a barn and sweep floors in exchange for crusts of bread. But more often, you became the town's unpaid laborer, servant, or scapegoat. People didn't see you as a child. They saw you as a tool. And if you broke under pressure, they'd find another orphan. You weren't a person in the eyes of the law. You had no family name to shield you, no dowry, no inheritance, and absolutely no rights. If someone beat you, no one was punished. If someone exploited you, no one came to save you. You existed in a legal and moral limbo where everyone could use you, but no one had to claim responsibility. And that made you perfect for exploitation. You could be passed around households, rented for field work, or sold into domestic service. In some cases, noble families even used orphans as human gifts to settle debts or gain favor. You weren't a child, you were a coin. Even the church, the supposed sanctuary of the weak, didn't offer much beyond the illusion of mercy. Monasteries might take you in, but not out of kindness. You were brought in to work, to sweep, scrub, clean, and obey. If you were lucky, a kind monk might teach you to read a little Latin, but don't get your hopes up. The real education was how to suffer in silence. And if you couldn't, there were beatings for that. Orphans didn't grow up. They survived. And if they made it to adulthood, it wasn't because of some noble triumph over adversity. It was because they learned to be invisible, to expect nothing, and to accept pain as normal. They became shadows in a world that didn't want to see them, ghosts among the living, childhoods swallowed before they had time to form. Being parentless in the Middle Ages wasn't a tragic footnote. It was the prologue to a life of being forgotten by design. No child chooses to become an orphan. But in the Middle Ages, the universe didn't care about choices. Death swept through towns and villages like clockwork, and it didn't ask questions. Sometimes it wore the face of war, a crusade gone sideways, a border raid, a knight settling scores with a torch. One minute you had a family, the next, a scream, a flash of steel, and silence. Your parents became corpses, and you became property, or nothing at all. Other times, death arrived quieter, but no less cruel. The plague didn't care if your mother was kind or your father strong. One infected merchant, one flea bite, and your house became a coffin. Neighbors locked their doors, priests stopped visiting, bodies piled in carts, and you, small and shaking in the corner, realized you were alone, not in a poetic sense. Alone as in no one's coming, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Famine was no gentler. Crops failed, livestock died, bread became dust. And when your parents couldn't feed themselves, they sure couldn't feed you. Some starved beside their children. Others walked into the forest and never returned, hoping maybe you'd be better off without another mouth gasping in the dark. You weren't orphaned by accident. You were orphaned by design, because in a world of scarcity, sacrifice always starts with the smallest and softest. The death toll wasn't just in numbers. It lived in the hollowing of villages, the burning of farmsteads, the sudden silence where laughter used to be. Whole communities vanished overnight. And when plague didn't kill your parents, superstition often finished the job. People believed illness came from sin. Your mother got sick? Maybe she made a pact with the devil. Your father's fever didn't break? Maybe he stole from the church, and if you survived, they looked at you sideways, like the last leaf on a dying tree. Unnatural, suspicious, possibly cursed. Surviving your parents' death didn't come with sympathy. It came with suspicion, stigma, and usually a new kind of danger. You became vulnerable not just to the elements, but to anyone who decided you were useful, profitable, or expendable. Orphans weren't protected by laws or watched over by elders. They were the flotsam left behind after the storm, the kindling for the next tragedy. And while history remembers kings and conquerors, the truth is, more children were orphaned in a single decade of plague than nobles ruled in a century. Each one had a face, a name, until they didn't. If you were lucky, or more accurately, if your suffering made someone else feel virtuous, you might end up under the church's roof. But taken in by the church didn't mean safety, comfort, or care. It meant control. It meant silence. And it most definitely meant work. The medieval church preached compassion, but it practiced something else entirely. A child without parents was not seen as a sacred responsibility. You were a test, a burden, a possible sinner in a small, fragile body. Monasteries and convents sometimes offered shelter to orphans, but not out of love. It was an arrangement. You received food and shelter, and in return your life became a service. Literally. You cleaned, you hauled water, you tended gardens you would never eat from, and you stayed quiet. You weren't there to be raised, you were there to be reformed, into obedience, humility, and labor. Punishment was seen as spiritual correction. Beatings weren't abuse, they were God's belt. And don't get the wrong idea, this wasn't some heavenly Hogwarts where kind monks taught Latin by candlelight. If you learned anything at all, it was usually scripture and repetition, drilled into you between chores. Latin verses were memorized not for meaning, but for discipline. You spoke only when permitted, laughed only when safe, and if you disobeyed, your penance came in the form of cold floors, fasting, or silence that stretched for weeks. The church believed that suffering purified the soul. You just happened to be the sponge. For orphaned girls, convents were often the only barrier between them and lives of even worse indignity. But even inside stone walls, their lives were ruled by isolation and austerity. Their identities were erased, their names replaced by titles like sister or child of grace. They scrubbed floors, churned butter, stitched vestments, and tried not to cry when night fell and the silence screamed. Outside the walls, their friends had vanished, married off, buried, or lost to disease. Inside, they became useful, invisible, and painfully obedient. The church was the only medieval institution with the reach and power to care for orphans, and yet it rarely saw them as children. Instead, they were seen as unformed souls needing discipline, correction, and spiritual molding. Their childhoods became novitiates in grief, and even the best among them, the ones who followed every rule, said every prayer, and kept every fast, were never promised a life. They were promised only salvation. For orphans, the church didn't offer a sanctuary. It offered a monastery-shaped cage. There's a reason orphans were passed from hand to hand like unwanted tools. They worked, and they worked hard. In a world without factories, motors, or machines, labor was currency, and orphaned children were the easiest way to get it cheap. The moment your parents died, your future was already assigned. You would toil. Not when you turned 16. Not after some apprenticeship or school. Immediately. You might be given to a blacksmith, a miller, or a farmer, each claiming they'd raise you in exchange for your help. What that meant, in reality, was rising before the sun, carrying pails twice your size, and collapsing into hay at night with splinters in your fingers and blisters on your feet. Meals were earned, not given, and if you were too slow, too small, or too weak, there was always another orphan in town. You were replaceable, disposable, forgettable. Medieval households ran on child labor. Orphans filled in where sons had died or daughters had married out. You became the invisible engine of other people's survival. You fetched water from frozen wells, swept ashes from hearths, plucked fleas from your master's dogs, and prayed your calloused hands wouldn't freeze shut in winter. Most of your waking hours were spoken for, and the few minutes of rest were haunted by the fear of doing something wrong. One broken jug, one burned loaf, and you'd be whipped or worse. Worse still, the work didn't come with training. You weren't taught a trade to help you one day earn a living. You were kept just useful enough to serve, but never skilled enough to leave. Any knowledge you gained was accidental. Most likely you'd die with the same calloused palms you had at age 7, still in service to someone who never once called you by name. In some cities, orphans were rounded up and forced into public projects, cleaning latrines, dredging rivers, hauling stones for cathedrals they'd never be allowed to enter. Their hands helped build the world, but their names were never written into it. For many, their backs broke before they reached adulthood. The lucky few who lived past 15 might escape to join a guild or earn pennies as a day laborer. But even then, their past followed them. No family name, no land, no legacy. Being an orphan wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a social sentence. It made you available to everyone and remembered by no one. In modern imagination, an orphanage is a place of refuge, a bed, a meal, perhaps even a kindly caretaker, and a chance at education. But in the Middle Ages, there was no such comfort. What you got instead was the workhouse, and the workhouse was never built to shelter children. It was built to extract value from them. If you ended up there, it meant someone, somewhere, decided you were still useful, not lovable, not adoptable, useful. These institutions went by different names in different towns, almshouses, poorhouses, foundling homes, but they all operated on the same belief. Poverty was your fault, and survival had to be earned. As a child, this meant you woke up in overcrowded, damp dormitories where sleep was scarce and warmth non-existent. You were fed enough to stand, clothed enough to work, and watched just enough to be punished if you failed. And fail you would, because the expectations were impossible. Chores ran from sunrise to sunset. You scrubbed floors that were never clean, carried buckets that never emptied, and stitched garments that would never be worn by you. There was no kindness in these halls, only hierarchy. Older children sometimes became pseudo-overseers, passing down beatings and orders like hand-me-downs. The few adults in charge rarely smiled. Some were clergy enforcing divine discipline. Others were stewards of charity with little interest in mercy. The idea wasn't to raise you. It was to break you into usefulness. The younger you learned submission, the more profitable you became. The harder you worked, the more you were praised but never loved. Sickness spread like rumor. With dozens of children packed together in one space, disease was always a breath away. Lice, fever, rot, these weren't occasional outbreaks. They were part of the furniture. No one isolated the sick unless it meant burying them faster. When children died, they were replaced, not mourned. A quick prayer, a shallow grave, and another orphan moved into the empty bed. If you could call straw stuffed into a sack a bed. Hope rarely visited the workhouse. You might dream of being taken in by a generous family, but generosity was rare and usually came with conditions. If someone offered to adopt you, it was likely because they needed a kitchen hand, a stable boy, or a girl to raise the other children while the mother rested. You'd go from one set of chores to another, and the best you could hope for was fewer beatings and better scraps. The workhouse never let you forget who you were, unwanted, inconvenient, and always on the edge of being discarded. It was a building made of stone and shame, and for thousands of orphans, it was the only version of home they'd ever know. If there was one constant in the life of a medieval orphan, it was hunger. Not just the kind that gnawed at your belly between meals, but a permanent ache that burrowed into your bones and lived there. Hunger shaped your thoughts, your actions, even your sense of time. It woke you up, walked beside you, and lay down with you at night. You didn't ask, "What's for dinner?" You asked, "Will there be dinner?" Orphans rarely ate with others. Meals weren't social, and they weren't structured. You were fed only after everyone else. In a workhouse, that meant the stewards and clergy took the best. In a household, it meant you waited until the master, his family, and even the dog were full. What remained was yours, but leftovers don't last long when there are 10 mouths and 1 bowl. You learned to eat fast, fight silently, and pretend you weren't starving. And what did you get when food appeared? Pottage, mostly. A greasy, gray stew that simmered forever and absorbed whatever was tossed in. Old roots, bruised cabbage, maybe a fish head or two if you were lucky. Meat was rare. Bread was hard. Milk spoiled. Water was risky. If you drank from the wrong stream, you'd spend days doubled over, your stomach punishing you for your thirst. And still, you drank. Because waiting for clean water meant dying first. Your body changed under constant hunger. You stopped growing. Your bones protruded. Your skin stretched too tightly over your frame. You looked older than your age, eyes sunken, cheeks hollow, always cold no matter the season. People mistook your silence for meekness. It was exhaustion. Talking took energy. Smiling took energy. You saved all of it for chewing when food came. Stealing wasn't rebellion. It was instinct. If you snatched a loaf from a market stall, it was because you hadn't eaten in 2 days, and your vision was starting to blur. If you were caught, you'd be beaten or jailed. If you weren't caught, you'd be hated anyway. No one pitied a hungry child. They feared you. Hunger turned you from victim to threat. Townsfolk believed hungry children led to theft, disease, and disorder. You were seen not as someone in need, but as a nuisance that might burn the bakery down. Starvation didn't kill quickly. It killed slowly, through weakness, confusion, and disease. Your immune system cracked. A cold became pneumonia. A cut became sepsis. All because your body had nothing left to fight with. Orphans didn't die of hunger directly. They died of everything that hunger let in. So when people say childhood is about innocence, joy, or discovery, remember that for medieval orphans, it was mostly about figuring out how to eat again tomorrow. If food was scarce, clothing was worse. For an orphan in the Middle Ages, getting dressed each day wasn't about fashion or comfort. It was about putting something, anything, between your skin and the wind. Your clothes didn't fit. They weren't clean. They weren't new. They were the faded, stretched, patched remains of someone else's life, passed down too many times and never intended for you. You didn't choose what you wore. You were handed it. Or more likely, it was tossed at you with a grunt and a warning not to tear it. A tunic too big, falling off one shoulder. Breeches too tight, tearing at the seams. If you were lucky, someone had stitched it last winter. If not, the holes had become windows into your skin. And in the medieval world, bare skin was not just cold. It was dangerous. Insect bites, infections, festering sores. Your clothes were your armor, and yours were crumbling. Most garments were made from coarse wool or rough-spun linen, stiff with age and stained with things you didn't want to guess. Washing wasn't an option. Soap was a luxury. Water had to be hauled and heated, and there was always more work to be done than laundry. Your tunic was worn until it rotted off your body, and even then it might be cut into rags to bind wounds or mop floors. Nothing was wasted, not even your discomfort. Shoes, if you had any, were more curse than blessing, ill-fitting scraps of leather held together by faith and wishful stitching. No soles, no protection. Most children went barefoot, stepping through mud, dung, broken pottery, and sharp stones, their feet growing calloused and cracked before they could spell their own names. Frostbite in winter, blisters in summer. You learned early to walk carefully, not out of grace, but survival. And then there were the lice, fleas, bedbugs. Your clothes were alive. Crawling, itching, biting reminders that you weren't alone. You'd scratch yourself raw, tearing skin in your sleep, waking to blood on your sleeves and straw in your hair. Even nobles had parasites, but they had servants to boil their linens and powders to drive pests away. You had none of that. You had only your nails and your shame. Your clothing didn't tell the world who you were. It told the world what you lacked. And you could feel the stares, how strangers turned their eyes, how adults wrinkled their noses when you walked past, how other children pulled away like your poverty might rub off on them. There were no cloaks to hide under, no clean sleeves to wipe your nose. Your garments didn't keep you warm. They kept you exposed. In medieval society, what you wore defined you, and when you had nothing, everyone could see it. In a world where survival was a full-time job, hygiene didn't just fall to the bottom of the list. It fell off it completely. Orphans, already forgotten by society, didn't stand a chance when it came to cleanliness. Baths weren't a weekly ritual. They weren't even yearly for some. You bathed when it rained hard enough. or when someone else decided you stank too much to sleep beside. Even then, it wasn't a warm soak. It was a cold stream, a cracked bucket, and shivering skin that never quite got dry. Water was precious, and people feared it. Medieval superstition claimed that bathing opened the pores and let disease in. That meant even if you wanted to clean yourself, others might forbid it. And where would you even do it? In a village well where everyone drank? In a ditch that doubled as a latrine? There were no soaps waiting on shelves. Just ashes, sand, or sharp reeds to scrape the grime off your arms. Most didn't even bother. Your hair became a nest, tangled, matted, and full of things that didn't belong. Lice burrowed behind your ears. Fleas danced across your scalp. Bedbugs rode in the folds of your sleeves. The itching was constant, an invisible fire you couldn't put out. You scratched until you bled, and when the wounds festered, there was no salve, only hope. Teeth rotted in your mouth from the moment they came in. There were no brushes, no rinses, no minty reprieve. You might chew on twigs or rinse with old wine if you had access to either. But mostly, you just watched your teeth fall out one by one, gray and cracked, leaving behind swollen gums and a bitter, metallic breath. Toothaches didn't go away. They settled in, like house guests. And when infection followed, it traveled down your jaw and into your blood. Children died from dental infections. A splintered molar could kill you, slowly, painfully. Clothes were never clean, which meant you never were either. Your skin absorbed the filth of every day. Soot, sweat, animal waste, your own blood, and sometimes worse. There were no perfumes, no scented oils, no towels neatly folded beside a basin. Only grime, pressed into your pores until you forgot what clean skin felt like. You didn't scrub it away. You learned to live inside it. To be an orphan in medieval times was to exist in a body under siege, not from swords or arrows, but from bacteria, insects, and the silent rot of neglect. You were dirty by default, diseased by assumption, and no matter how hard you tried, the filth didn't wash off, because dirt wasn't just on you, it was your status. In the Middle Ages, education was a privilege, and if you were an orphan, privilege was something you'd never even heard of. You weren't sent to school, you were sent to work. Letters, numbers, and books belonged to the sons of nobles and the children of wealthy merchants. For you, the only thing you read was body language. When to run, when to bow, when to pretend you weren't listening. Your classroom was the field, the kitchen, the stable. Your curriculum, obedience, silence, and survival. Formal education required paper, ink, and time, none of which were spent on a child with no name and no future. Monasteries and cathedral schools taught reading and Latin, yes, but only to boys destined for the cloth or noble service. You, however, were too busy fetching firewood and cleaning chamber pots. The church might have handed you a prayer to recite, but not to understand. You mouthed syllables like spells, hoping not to be punished for forgetting one. Learning wasn't a path to freedom. It was a reminder that freedom wasn't for you. Even among other peasants, orphans fell lower. A peasant child might be taught by a parent how to sow, to reap, to trade, to avoid trouble. But you had no parent. No one passed down knowledge. No one explained how to tell good grain from moldy. You were left to copy others, make mistakes, get punished, and try again. Everything you learned the hard way, with bruises, hunger, and shame. And then there was language. In many towns, orphans spoke a different dialect, or had no consistent way to communicate. They were shuffled between places, left to pick up bits and pieces like broken pottery. You weren't eloquent, you were fragmented, and people noticed. They assumed you were simple, slow, or cursed. You might have been clever, brilliant even, but with no one to nurture that spark, it simply went dark. Some towns had scribes, men who carved law and land into parchment. They could write your fate in ink and never spell your name right, if they wrote it at all. You weren't seen as worthy of record. There were no scrolls for orphans, no biographies, no histories. The most a record keeper might jot down was "small boy taken in by the baker," and that wasn't a name. It was a footnote. What passed for education in your world was humiliation. You were corrected more than you were taught, and when you made a mistake, the rod was swifter than the lesson. Your mind wasn't cultivated, it was disciplined. You weren't encouraged to ask questions. You were trained to never speak unless spoken to. So, while noble children practiced poetry in candlelit halls and debated Latin philosophy, you were out in the rain, trying to remember which herb might stop a fever, and hoping you didn't confuse it with the one that would kill someone. That was your education. Dangerous trial and costly error. In the Middle Ages, discipline didn't mean structure. It meant fear, especially for orphans who lived entirely at the mercy of others. You weren't just punished when you did something wrong. You were punished because someone had a bad day, because the crops failed, because a noble was angry, because God, they said, needed you to learn humility. And if it took a stick, a fist, or a belt to do that, so be it. Beatings were the answer to every question. Why did you spill the water? Why did you forget the prayer? Why were you late? The moment someone decided you had failed, the punishment was swift. You didn't get a chance to explain. You didn't get a warning. You got hit, and no one came to stop it. A crying child wasn't cause for alarm. It was background noise. In workhouses, rods were kept close to hand, not because children were unruly, but because adults liked control. The idea wasn't to scare you once, it was to keep you scared forever. Fear was obedience, and obedience was expected from the moment you could walk. The beatings weren't just physical, they were theatrical, public. They reminded every child in the room what happened if you stepped out of line. Some masters beat children with switches. Others used paddles, canes, or whatever was within reach. If you were lucky, it was wood. If you weren't, it was metal. The marks lasted for days, sometimes weeks. But the bruises on your body faded faster than the ones in your mind. After enough time, you didn't flinch because you were afraid. You flinched because your body had learned to expect pain. And yet, this was normal. Expected. No one called it cruelty. They called it correction. The church sanctioned it. Parents did it. Teachers did it. And since orphans had no parents to step in, no one even pretended to protect you. You became an outlet, a scapegoat, a release valve for adult frustration. Girls weren't spared. They were punished differently, sometimes with silence, isolation, or shame, but just as harshly. Locked in cupboards, denied food, forced to kneel for hours. Your gender didn't save you. It only changed the method. Eventually, the beatings didn't even make you cry, not because they didn't hurt, but because crying was dangerous. It made you weak. It made you a target. So you bit your lip, clenched your fists, and stared at the floor while the pain passed through you like weather. And the worst part wasn't the hurt. It was the realization that no one would stop it. No one cared. In medieval society, the rod wasn't spared. It was passed down like tradition. And orphans, voiceless, rootless, and utterly alone, felt every blow history had to offer. In a world where every word could earn you a beating, silence wasn't just golden. It was armor. For orphans, silence was the most valuable skill they could ever learn. It didn't matter if you were hungry, hurt, or humiliated. Speaking up was a gamble you couldn't afford to take. Words made you noticeable, and being noticed in the Middle Ages was rarely a good thing. Silence was how you vanished in plain sight, how you made yourself smaller than the dirt under the Lord's boots, how you stayed alive. No one wanted to hear from an orphan. You didn't get to ask why or when or please. Your job was to do, nod, bow, and retreat. If you were asked a question, you answered quickly and without eye contact. If you weren't asked, you didn't speak. Not about the blisters on your feet, not about the lice in your hair, not even about the older boy who stole your bread and bruised your ribs. There were no points for honesty, no sympathy for truth, only pain for opening your mouth. Silence wasn't just learned, it was beaten in. The first time you cried for help and no one came, the lesson began. The second time, when someone did come, but with a belt or a rod, that lesson hardened. By the third time, you stopped crying altogether. Not because it didn't hurt, but because hurt was normal. Talking about it wasn't. Even among other orphans, quiet was currency. You never knew who might repeat what you said. Gossip was dangerous. It could lead to punishment, exile from what little comfort you had, or worse, being marked as trouble. And once that label stuck, you were done. Given the dirtiest chores, ignored during meals, blamed when things went wrong. So you kept your head down and your mouth closed. Sometimes silence was all you had left. After everyone else had taken your food, your blankets, your dignity, your voice was the final thing you controlled. So you held it close, like a dying ember. You whispered to yourself when no one was around, made up stories in your head, sang songs under your breath you barely remembered. You didn't speak aloud, but inside, your voice still lived, fragile, flickering, refusing to die. Children are born with laughter, questions, curiosity. But orphans in medieval times learned quickly that none of those things could save them. What saved them was disappearing into silence. Silence didn't protect you from pain, but it hid you from worse. And in a world that punished sound, silence became the only freedom you could afford. Now and then, someone would show up at the door. A man with a heavy coat, a woman with a sour smile. They'd walk through the orphanage or workhouse, looking over the children like livestock. They weren't looking for a son or daughter. They were looking for labor, for free help, for a body small enough to crawl under carts or clean chimneys. And if they picked you, people said you were lucky. You were chosen, saved, given a second chance. But the truth was, you were bought. Medieval adoption didn't mean family. It meant ownership. You weren't brought into a home. You were brought into a contract, an unspoken agreement that you'd give everything and expect nothing. If you worked hard and stayed quiet, you might be given scraps and a blanket. If not, there was always the road, or the workhouse again, or worse. Once taken in, you had no rights. There was no paper trail, no court oversight, no one to call if things went wrong. If your new master beat you, overworked you, or locked you in a shed for forgetting to bow, you were his responsibility, which meant you were his problem to handle however he saw fit. Complaints weren't just ignored, they were punished. And no one ever asked how you were adjusting. The adopted life was often worse than the orphanage. You had no peers, no stolen moments of whispered friendship in the dark. You worked alone, ate last, slept by the hearth if you were lucky, in the barn if you weren't. Girls were sometimes adopted into households with sons not much older than them, and the unspoken dangers hung heavy in the air. Things you were too young to name but old enough to fear. You were always being watched, and not always for reasons you understood. Occasionally, someone decent might take you in. A widow who needed help but wasn't cruel. A tradesman who believed in fairness. But those stories were rare. The kind you heard in whispers. The exception, not the rule. Most orphans didn't get rescued. They got recycled, fed into the next family's grindstone of chores, shouted at over spilled milk, punished for taking too long to wake. And through it all, you were expected to be grateful, to bow your head, to thank your new parents for the chance to serve them. Because in the eyes of the world, being chosen meant you were blessed. And if you dared to speak about the beatings, or the hunger, or the fear, you were ungrateful, disrespectful, broken. In truth, the lucky ones didn't escape. They just got a different kind of prison. One with a roof, a master, and no bars. Just expectations heavy enough to crush whatever hope you had left. If you were an orphan in medieval Europe, your life was already hard. But if you were a girl, it wasn't just hard. It was brutal in a way few would ever acknowledge. You didn't just lack protection. You were the thing people felt entitled to use, silence, or sell. Boys were sent to the fields or the forge. You were sent to the kitchen, the laundry, or the bedroom. Your body didn't belong to you, and your silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Orphaned girls were often adopted or taken in for a single purpose, to serve. And serve had layers. You fetched water, tended fires, cleaned chamber pots, fed babies that weren't yours, and stitched clothing until your fingers bled. You were expected to do everything, and do it quietly, invisibly, without asking for anything in return. But work wasn't your only burden. The moment you began to grow into a woman, the danger changed. You weren't just an orphan anymore. You were a target. Some girls were married off before they even bled for the first time. 12, 13 years old. Offered in exchange for a favor, land or livestock. Consent wasn't a concept. No one asked if you understood marriage. No one cared if the man was twice your age. The ceremony was short, the consequences lifelong. You went from unpaid servant to unwilling wife, expected to bear children, endure pain, and smile through both. Those who weren't married were still vulnerable. Abuse came from masters, older sons, priests, strangers in the street. You learned to make yourself small, quiet, and forgettable. Eye contact became dangerous. Trust became extinct. You didn't walk, you crept. You didn't sleep, you waited. And if something terrible happened, you were the one blamed for tempting, for existing, for not being modest enough in a world where your only clothes were someone else's hand-me-downs. The church spoke of purity and virtue, but rarely offered protection. If you were defiled, you were told to pray harder. If you spoke up, you were labeled trouble. The solution wasn't justice. It was hiding you, sending you to a convent, or casting you out. Girls who got pregnant were often abandoned entirely, turned into symbols of shame, and the child, if it lived, became just another orphan in a world already too full of them. There was no girlhood, no space to grow, laugh, or learn. There was only survival, and even that came at a cost. You aged faster, smiled less, trusted nothing. And if you reached womanhood intact, it was a miracle. But miracles were rare. Most orphan girls disappeared long before anyone remembered their names. Because in a world built for men, an orphaned girl was born with 2 strikes, no parents, and the wrong gender. Orphans in medieval society were not nurtured, protected, or guided. They were utilized. There was no concept of childhood as a sacred time of innocence. if you didn't have parents to fight for your right to rest, to play, to simply be a child. You didn't get those things. What you got was work, fear, and an endless series of roles to fill for other people's comfort. From the moment someone took you in or claimed you off the street, you became an asset. Not a son, not a daughter, an asset. You were trained not to grow, but to obey, not to flourish, but to function. Your value wasn't in your dreams, it was in your output. How fast could you scrub? How far could you carry? How long could you work before your legs gave out? Love was a language you never heard. You might be fed, you might be clothed, but you weren't hugged, not tucked in at night, not asked how you were feeling. Affection was something given to the children who mattered, the blood children, the ones with names and land and futures. You were the one who cleaned up after them, who stood in the background of their portraits, unnamed and unsmiling. You were moved around constantly, passed between households like worn-out furniture. One master tired of you, another would take you. Each new place came with its own rules, its own dangers. You learned to adapt so quickly it became instinct. Smile when they smile, bow when they raise their hand. Don't ask, don't out-challenge, don't hope. And when you were finally too old to be adorable and too young to have power, you were cast out. 18, maybe 16, maybe younger. You were expected to survive on your own, with no money, no family, and no skills beyond the ones used to serve others. Some ended up on the streets, some in brothels, some disappeared entirely. The lie was that you were being raised. But what really happened was this. You were used. Every ounce of labor, every piece of dignity, every dream drained out of you for the benefit of those who never intended to lift you up. And when you were no longer useful, you were forgotten. You weren't raised, you were repurposed. And for many, that was the most heartbreaking fate of all, because being unloved hurts, but being used instead of loved, that's a wound that never fully heals. If no one took you in, not the church, not a workhouse, not even a desperate farmer, you ended up exactly where the rest of society thought you belonged, the streets. The streets of medieval towns weren't paved with opportunity. They were paved with filth, waste, and the remains of yesterday's survival attempts. There was no mercy in the alleys, no charity in the shadows. The streets didn't raise you with wisdom or warmth. They raised you with scars. You slept wherever your legs gave out, under carts, behind latrines, in graveyards when no one was watching. Rain leaked through roofs you didn't own. Frost sank into bones still growing. Rats weren't pests. They were neighbors. At least they didn't ask for anything. You lived in a constant state of calculation. Where to hide, where to beg, what scraps might be edible, who might kick you just for being visible. Every town had its unspoken codes. You learned them fast, or you didn't survive. Which baker might toss a crust, which alley was safe to collapse in, which guards looked away, and which ones didn't. Most people passed you like smoke, as if you weren't there. Or worse, they saw you, and saw a nuisance, someone stealing the air, the attention, the resources. They blamed you for the plague, for the thefts, for the unease, as if your hunger was a threat, as if your existence offended their order. The towns smelled of rot and sewage. Chamber pots were emptied from windows above. You learned early to shout, "Garde-lou," before walking beneath a second-story ledge. And if you didn't, you got a lesson in medieval hygiene from above. You didn't smell worse than the street. You were the street. Your skin took on the texture of old leather. Your hair matted into clumps. your nails cracked from cold and grime. You stopped noticing. The other street children weren't always friends. Sometimes they were the only competition. If you found a bread crust, you ate it fast. If you found a place to sleep, you didn't speak of it. Everyone was desperate. Desperation didn't create community. It created caution. Trust was rare, betrayal was common, and kindness could get you killed. And yet, some survived. Not by growing strong, but by growing sharp. Cleverness became your armor. You learned to listen better than you spoke, to predict pain before it came, to pretend you were invisible even when you were being watched. You became a ghost in your own life, always moving, always hungry, always one misstep away from being swept into a gutter and never mentioned again. The streets didn't raise you like a parent. They raised you like a storm, loud, cold, and always ready to swallow you whole. On the medieval streets, begging wasn't a last resort. It was the only strategy left, and it didn't come from laziness. It came from empty bellies, frost-bitten fingers, and a world that refused to feed children who couldn't pay. But begging wasn't safe. It wasn't quiet. It was a daily performance, a tightrope walk between pity and punishment. You knelt with your head down and your hands out, not out of reverence, but out of necessity. Sometimes you were ignored, and in a way, that was the best outcome. A few people might toss coins, fewer still, a chunk of stale bread, but more often, you were chased off, called names, accused of deceit. That one's faking it. He's too strong to beg. She'll steal your purse if you blink. You were a child, yes, but you weren't seen as innocent. You were seen as a threat with dirty feet and hungry eyes. Guards didn't protect beggars. They harassed them. A child seen begging too close to the market could be cuffed, kicked, or locked in a stockade for the crowd to mock. You didn't get warnings. You got bruises. Towns wanted to appear pious, but not uncomfortable. You were a blemish on the image they wanted to project. Clean streets, safe squares, quiet poor. You disrupted all of that, and yet you had to try. You begged even when you knew it might lead to pain. Because going a day without food meant a night without sleep. A second day meant your knees buckled. A third, and your body started to eat itself. So you smiled at people who hated you. You held out your hand, knowing it might be slapped. You thanked them even when they spat. Not because you believed they cared, but because pretending made the moment go faster. Sometimes other orphans taught you tricks, how to fake a cough, how to limp believably, how to cry on command. It wasn't manipulation, it was survival. You weren't lying to cheat someone, you were lying to stay alive. A few silver coins might mean a crust of bread, a moment of warmth, a delay in your slow march toward starvation. And still, if you earned too much attention, or too much resentment, you might be dragged to the town square and punished publicly. A child tied to a post, whipped not for theft, but for asking. The message was clear. Starve quietly, or suffer loudly. Begging didn't demean you. The world did that. You were simply trying to survive in a society that decided your suffering should be out of sight, or else punished for daring to be seen. In the stories the nobles told, thieves were wicked, creatures of sin, shadows in the corners of otherwise peaceful towns. But in the world orphans lived in, stealing wasn't sin. It was necessity. There were no full plates waiting at home, no pocket change, no parents to whisper, "Just be patient, we'll find something." Hunger didn't whisper. It screamed. And when screaming didn't fill your belly, you learned to steal. Theft, for an orphan, didn't start as rebellion. It started as survival math. One loaf of bread might keep you alive another day. One apple could quiet the stomach long enough to avoid passing out. If you were careful, you took without being seen. If you were desperate, you didn't care who saw. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, the punishment didn't match the crime. Caught stealing? You weren't scolded, you were maimed. A hand taken, an ear sliced, branded with hot iron or tied to a post for the public to spit on. They didn't see a starving child. They saw a future criminal, a burden, a mistake to be corrected before it grew bolder. Towns used you as an example, not because you were dangerous, but because you were available. Easy to hurt, easier to ignore. You didn't steal because you wanted more. You stole because there was nothing else. No job, no charity, no system to catch you when you fell. So you took scraps from bakeries, fish from docks, herbs from gardens. Things that would never be missed by those who had more than they needed. And yet, those same people screamed the loudest when they caught you. Not because of what you took, but because of what you represented. A reminder that their comfort was built on someone else's cold. Older orphans sometimes banded together, forming ragged little networks of theft and barter. One distracted the merchant, another grabbed the goods, a third sold the stolen bread for coins to buy something less risky. These groups didn't last. Hunger turned allies into rivals. Fear drove wedges, and betrayal was always a moment away. You didn't feel proud after stealing. You felt fear, guilt, relief. Sometimes all three. You didn't sleep well. You didn't eat with joy. But you survived. That was the currency of the orphan. Theft, not for power, not for pleasure, but for one more day. And no matter how hard society tried to paint you as the villain, you knew the truth. You weren't the threat. You were the consequence of greed, of apathy, of a world that left children on the edge of survival, then called them wicked for trying not to fall. Sometimes the cruelty became too much. The beatings, the hunger, the stares, the cold silence of a house where you were barely tolerated, or the roar of a street that never let you sleep. So you ran, not toward anything, just away. Away from the hands that struck, away from the eyes that judged, away from the voices that called you useless, burden, wretched. But in the Middle Ages, running away wasn't freedom. It was a sentence without a destination. Where did you go? The next village, maybe. The woods, the roads between places, filled with travelers too wary to offer help, and bandits too eager to take advantage. Runaways were easy prey. Alone, small, unwanted. You didn't need a backstory. Your ragged clothes told the world everything. This one has no protection. No one looking for them. No one who will avenge them. You walked until your feet blistered, until your muscles seized from cold and exhaustion. You stole sleep under trees, in abandoned sheds, inside barns where cows slept warmer than you did. You hoped for a kind soul to take you in, but most doors stayed shut, and the ones that opened often led to a new version of the same misery you ran from. A different master, a different whip, a different bed of straw to cry into at night. Some runaways ended up in monasteries, lying about their pasts just to get through the gate. Others were caught by patrols, dragged back in chains, or conscripted into field labor as punishment. And then there were the ones who simply disappeared, swallowed by rivers, lost in snow, buried in shallow graves under fake names or no names at all. Their stories ended where no one noticed. Their lives became ghost stories told to scare the obedient. Don't run, or you'll end up like them. But even knowing all this, orphans still ran. Because some things are worse than dying in the woods. Living without hope was one of them. When every moment of your life is controlled, when every breath is owned by someone else, escape becomes the only act of rebellion you have left. Even if it ends badly. Even if it ends quietly. The cruel truth was that for most orphans, there was nowhere to run. Not really. But that didn't stop them. Because even if freedom was an illusion, it was a beautiful one. And in a world built entirely from nightmares, sometimes a lie was the only dream you had. For some orphans, there was no question of workhouses, streets, or begging. They weren't abandoned to survive on their own. They were taken and sold. Like sacks of grain, like sheep, like property. One day, you were sweeping the floor. The next, you were loaded onto a cart. No explanation, no goodbye, no choice. You didn't go to a new family. You went to a new owner. There were no adoption papers, no protections, no records of consent. Just a whispered exchange behind a tavern, a nod from a priest, a handful of coins from a man with a kind face and cold eyes. In towns riddled with poverty and chaos, orphans became currency, a way for overburdened parishes, workhouses, or even desperate relatives to unload responsibility. "He'll be better off," they said. "They have land. She'll be fed." But none of that was promised, and none of it came true. You were bartered by priests, monks, and sometimes even by other orphans who'd learned the trade. Little boys sold to tanners or millers, girls handed to widows or innkeepers. You were cleaned just enough to seem presentable, then paraded like livestock. You didn't understand what was happening until it was too late, until the cart pulled away and the hands that once hit you looked almost kind compared to the ones waiting at your new destination. Sometimes it was worse than labor. Children were sold not to homes or workshops, but into pleasure houses. Girls, especially. If you were pretty or simply small enough to be called innocent, you were valuable. Not for your future, but for your body. Some buyers used veils of politeness, maids, companions, entertainers, but everyone knew. You weren't a worker. You were prey. The worst part, you couldn't run. If you did, they brought you back. And the next time they tied you tighter, locked the door harder, watched you closer. Some were branded to prevent escape. Others were maimed early, just enough to make running difficult. Because now you weren't just a child, you were an investment. You learned quickly to stay quiet, work fast, and never ask questions. You were always being watched. You were always at risk of being resold. You were owned in body, but never in spirit. That tiny defiance was all you had left. The silent hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would come who didn't want to buy you. Someone who would see you, save you. But most of the time, no one came. You were just another face in a long line of lost children, traded like grain at a market that only cared about profit. Beyond quiet sales and whispered exchanges, there were places where children were sold openly, publicly, legally. Slave markets didn't just exist in far-off lands. They thrived in parts of Europe, often hidden behind the polite language of apprenticeship or servitude. But the truth was undeniable. These were auctions for human lives, and orphans, unclaimed, unprotected, and utterly disposable, were the easiest prey. You arrived in rags. You stood in a line. You were told to smile, to bow, to show your teeth or your wrists or the way you held a bucket. Buyers walked past like farmers inspecting oxen. They asked your age, your strength, whether you could read or sew. They prodded you, measured your arms, pulled back your hair to check for lice. Every word spoken about you was in the third person, as if you weren't there, as if you were just a sack of barley with a heartbeat. The bidding was fast, cold. Sometimes you were sold in seconds. Other times, no one wanted you, and you were kept overnight in a cage with others, huddled together, sharing stories you barely understood, wishing someone, anyone, would stop it. But no one did. Girls fetched higher prices if they were pretty or quiet. Boys if they looked sturdy enough to haul water or swing a pickaxe. Infants were sold too, swaddled in stained cloth, passed around like produce. Some cried, most didn't. They already knew better. This wasn't a back-alley operation. These markets were part of life, open secrets, approved by magistrates and church leaders alike. Some were hosted near cathedrals, others in the shadow of castles. A few were even run by guilds, because training a child servant was cheaper than hiring an adult laborer. Once sold, you didn't go to a better place. You went to someone who wanted something from you. Everything from your energy to your silence to your innocence. And if you were lucky, they didn't beat it out of you too quickly. If you were unlucky, they didn't stop until you broke. There were no laws protecting you, no inspectors, no records. If you vanished, no one asked questions. If you were resold, no one checked why. You belonged to the one who paid, and payment was considered proof of righteousness. The slave market didn't hide its cruelty. It didn't have to, because the world didn't care about orphans. It only cared about who owned them. To the nobility, orphans weren't people. They were tools, quiet, pliable bodies to sweep the floor, wash the chamber pots, carry firewood, and vanish into the background. Every castle needed servants. Every manor required invisible hands to polish boots, pour wine, and scrub the blood off stone floors. And who better than a child with no name, no parents, and no one to ask where they went? When nobles took in orphans, it wasn't charity. It was economics. Servants born into peasant families might still have ties, someone to check on them, someone to cause trouble if they disappeared. But an orphan, you belonged to no one. You were ideal, cheap, silent, disposable. If you died from overwork, they didn't even have to notify a priest. They just sent for another. You were given livery too big for your bones, shoes with holes in the soles, and tasks that began before dawn and ended long after dusk. If you slept indoors, you were lucky. More often, you curled near the kitchen hearth or in a corner of the stable, close to warmth, but never comfort. You ate the scraps the dogs didn't want. You drank from buckets used to rinse chamber pots. And when nobles laughed about the smell of the help, they were laughing at you. Every noble child needed a servant child, someone to button their coat, brush their horse, and bear the brunt of their tantrums. You weren't a friend. You weren't a playmate. You were a cushion for their rage, a doll to be kicked and ignored. If the young master tripped you, you apologized. If the lady accused you of stealing, you didn't defend yourself. You begged. The adults weren't better. The head maid would beat you for wrinkles in the linen. The steward would slap you for being slow. The Lord might ignore you entirely, until one day he didn't, and you'd wish he never had. And the lady of the house, she might smile, might even pat your head, but you were never more than background, something to make her appear more generous at the feast table. Once in noble service, Your life belonged to the house. You could not leave. You could not rest. You could not dream. You existed so others could live in comfort, so they could drape themselves in velvet while you froze in wool, so they could toast to justice while you swept the ashes of their fire. To be an orphan in a noble house wasn't a step up. It was a sentence, with no trial, no appeal, and no end. In the Middle Ages, the church was power. It controlled life and death, sin and salvation. But behind the incense and scripture, there were darker things. And for orphans, alone, voiceless, desperate, the church was not always a sanctuary. Sometimes it was a trap, because not every man of God was a man of mercy, and not every priest saw a child and thought of the soul. Some saw only silence, obedience, and the perfect victim. Monasteries and priories took in orphans to cleanse their public image. They were praised for charity, hailed for compassion. But what happened behind closed doors rarely matched the sermons. Children were assigned to priests as servants. They cleaned robes, prepared baths, polished pews, and fetched wine. But often, the duties didn't end there. You couldn't say no. You didn't even know the words to say. You were taught that priests were holy, that questioning them was sin, that obedience to them was obedience to God. So when the hand touched where it shouldn't, when the whisper came in the night, when the door locked behind you, you froze, and the silence you'd learned for survival became a prison you couldn't escape. If you spoke out, you weren't believed. You were a child, dirty, probably a liar, maybe even possessed. They said you wanted attention, that you misunderstood, that he was a respected man of God. And you were an orphan, a charity case, a nobody. Worse, they might say you tempted him, that you had evil in you, that your suffering was proof of sin. And just like that, the shame became yours. The church kept records of births and deaths, but it didn't keep records of those moments, of the hundreds of children who flinched when the bell rang, of the girls who never spoke again, of the boys who ran and never stopped. The abuse was buried beneath marble floors and stained glass windows, hidden behind chants and pageantry, protected by silence. Some priests were good, gentle, honest, but that didn't undo the others, the ones who twisted scripture into a weapon, who preyed on fear, who knew no one would stop them, because stopping them would mean admitting the church had shadows. And so the orphans prayed, not for salvation, but for invisibility, to be overlooked, forgotten, left alone. Because in a world where the church was supposed to be refuge, it sometimes became the most dangerous place of all. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't always about love. Often it was a transaction. Land, alliances, livestock, legacy. But for orphaned girls, marriage wasn't a bond. It was a sentence. You didn't fall in love. You were assigned. You didn't walk down the aisle in joy. You were led, like an animal, to market. And most of the time, no one even asked your age. Some girls were married off before their voices deepened. 10, 11, 12 years old, barely old enough to bleed. Certainly not old enough to understand what it meant to be a wife. But none of that mattered. You were a body, a potential womb, a pair of hands to keep the house running. Older men, widowers, landowners, even soldiers would take in orphan girls, not for care or companionship, but because a child bride was cheap labor and easy to control. Consent wasn't required. Neither was compassion. A priest performed the blessing, a witness signed the ledger, and you were someone's property, legally. Your new husband might be kind, or he might beat you for smiling, or worse, not smiling enough. You had no say, no exit, and no protections. Your body became his. Your labor became his. Even your silence became his. Marriage stripped you of the few freedoms you had left as a girl. Once wed, you couldn't leave, couldn't speak out, couldn't escape. If you tried, you were called a runaway, a harlot, a dishonor to your husband's name. You weren't a victim. You were a scandal, and the punishment was never for him. It was always for you. Pregnancy often followed, not out of hope, but inevitability. And with it came danger. Childbirth in the medieval world was already treacherous, but for girls too young, too malnourished, too unprepared, it was lethal. Your body cracked under pressure it was never meant to bear. If the child lived, you had one more mouth to feed, one more life to protect in a world that didn't care if you survived. If the child died, so might you. Sometimes these marriages were disguised as kindness. We gave her a home. She's lucky to be married. But you knew the truth. You weren't chosen. You were claimed, like a found coin, like a lost sheep. Something picked up off the road and branded for ownership. You didn't dream of weddings. You dreaded them. Because in the world of orphans, a ring didn't promise love. It promised ownership. And behind every forced vow was a childhood stolen, and a voice silenced forever. If hunger didn't kill you, disease was waiting in the wings. And for orphans, it didn't just wait. It hunted. You were the perfect target, thin, cold, malnourished, and forgotten. In a world with no doctors, no hygiene, and no understanding of germs, disease was a wildfire. And you, small and unprotected, were the driest kindling. You lived surrounded by sickness. In workhouses, filth clung to every surface. In the streets, waste ran down the gutters and soaked into your skin. The air was thick with rot. The water was tainted. The food, if you got any, was half spoiled. And every breath felt like a risk. Fevers spread fast. One cough in the dormitory became 20 the next morning. Rashes turned black. Fingers swelled, eyes dimmed, and before you even had a name in your village, you were being wrapped in cloth. You didn't get medicine. You got prayers. Maybe a hot stone placed on your stomach. Maybe a moldy poultice wrapped around a wound. But mostly, you got distance. People stepped back the moment you looked pale. No one risked tending a sick orphan, not out of cruelty but fear. If you were sick, you were mocked. Not just by death, but by stigma. You were contagious, cursed, unlucky. Children like you brought pestilence, and yet you still had to work. No one cared that your joints ached or your skin burned. You dragged your bucket. You scrubbed the floor. You held your stomach and coughed in silence, because the only thing worse than being a sick orphan was being a useless one. The most terrifying illnesses struck in silence. A scratch turned into a swollen limb. A sneeze became lung rot. A stomach cramp became death within a day. No warning, no treatment, just your body betraying you in real time. And even if you survived, the scars stayed. A missing eye, a limp, a hacking cough that never went away. And with those came a new label, undesirable. Many orphans were buried without names. Some were burned, others thrown in mass graves covered with quicklime. No marker, no ceremony, just a hole and a shovel. You became one of hundreds who never made it to adulthood, never remembered in the church records, never spoken of again. Because in medieval Europe, disease didn't just kill the body, it erased the person. And for orphans who had so little identity to begin with, it meant disappearing without even a whisper. When a noble died, the church bells rang. Candles burned in every chapel. Priests read Latin over silk-shrouded corpses, and mourners wept into lace sleeves. But when an orphan died, silence. No toll, no prayers, no name carved in stone, just another body added to the earth as quickly and quietly as possible. Most orphan deaths were handled like waste disposal. Not out of hatred, just indifference. No one knew your parents. No one remembered your birthday. No one even knew what to call you if you'd been passed between households or streets. You died as you lived, unclaimed, and the less fuss made, the better. Workhouses didn't have room for the dead. They had barely enough for the living. If you were in an institution, your body might be wrapped in cloth, old, stained, reused many times, and taken out the back door. A shallow grave was dug, often in common soil used for criminals, strangers, or other unfortunates. Sometimes you were buried with several others. Children stacked like forgotten scrolls in a chest. No marker, no blessing, no record. The church claimed to care for souls, but even they drew lines. A paid funeral was one thing. A free burial? That was a charity reserved for the few deemed worthy. And orphans, especially those who died of disease, neglect, or violence, rarely qualified. You weren't worth the cost of incense or the effort of a funeral mass. Some children were buried by other children. The oldest orphan in the group might drag the body, too small to carry it properly, across dirt roads and fields. A grave dug with trembling hands, tears dried by the wind. There was no eulogy, just a whisper. A memory, if you were lucky. Maybe someone said your name, maybe. In towns where superstition ruled stronger than faith, orphan corpses were feared. A dead child who hadn't been baptized or who had died suddenly might be viewed as a ghost in the making. Their graves were dug far from town, sometimes marked not with stones, but with sticks or curses. If you were thought to have died of plague, your body might be burned instead. No final rites, just flames rising as the villagers muttered prayers and turned their backs. But the worst part wasn't the grave. It was the forgetting. How fast it happened. One day you were there, sweeping or begging or coughing in a corner. The next, gone. And no one paused. No one lit a candle. No one whispered a farewell. You vanished like smoke, like mist, like you were never there at all. And that's what scared the other orphans most, not death itself, but the idea that when they were gone, no one would even notice. In the Middle Ages, the church didn't just shape faith, it shaped reality. Who lived, who died, who mattered, and who didn't, all filtered through the pulpit. For orphans, this meant their entire existence was judged not by who they were, but by what the church believed they were worth. And usually, that wasn't much. The church preached about mercy and charity. It collected tithes, urged nobles to give alms, and warned the faithful that neglecting the poor was a sin. But in practice, the orphans who lived under its watch knew that those promises came with fine print. You could be fed, but only if you were obedient. You could be sheltered, but only if you worked. And you could be blessed, but only if you didn't make anyone uncomfortable. The church didn't just feed bodies, it managed souls, which meant your suffering had to be useful. If you were docile and pitiful, you were pure. If you were angry, defiant, or too loud in your misery, you were suspicious, possibly possessed, possibly beyond saving. The same child who swept the floors of the priory could be accused of wickedness if they asked why they were always hungry. And once that label stuck, it was nearly impossible to scrape off. Every orphan's fate within the church depended on how well they fit the story the church wanted to tell. Were you an innocent lamb, Abandoned but humble? You might be taken in. Were you clever, sharp-tongued, or simply unlucky? You were cast out, sometimes exercised, sometimes punished, sometimes just lost. And then there were the rules. So many rules. Orphans were expected to confess, even if they didn't understand what sin they'd committed. To fast, even when their ribs already showed. To attend Mass, even if they could barely stand. To keep silent, even when terrified. Your value was measured by your usefulness and your quietness. Speak up, and you were a problem. Cry out, and you were a danger. Worst of all, the church decided what happened after you died. If you weren't baptized, your soul was considered damned, or at best, trapped in limbo. If you'd ever questioned your masters, fought back, or been accused of sin without repentance, you were said to risk hell, and they told you this. A sick child was often made to confess in tears, while a priest muttered Latin over their trembling body, not to comfort them, but to ensure the church's books were clean when the child slipped away. In the eyes of God, all were equal, but in the halls of the church, orphans ranked low, below nobles, below priests, below the merchants who paid for masses. You weren't seen as holy. You were seen as baggage, a test, a burden, a soul to be managed, not honored. And so your fate was decided not by love, but by doctrine, not by kindness, but by policy, not by faith, but by fear. Medieval charity wasn't born of empathy. It was born of fear. Fear of damnation. Fear of divine judgment. Fear that hoarded wealth might drag a soul into hell unless a portion was offered, publicly and performatively, to the poor. And among the poor, orphans made the best props. Small, pitiful, hollow-eyed, easy to pity, easier to forget. Giving to them wasn't a gesture of compassion. It was a kind of spiritual insurance. Rich townspeople and minor nobles gave alms because the church demanded it. Tithes, donations, leftover bread from feasts, all distributed not to lift orphans from despair, but to soothe the consciences of those who had more than they needed. They gave once a week, or once a feast day, or once a deathbed loomed, and expected that to be enough. The child who received a crust of bread was meant to be grateful. The noble who handed it over expected to be praised. Almsgiving was theater. Orphans were dragged to the edges of banquets, seated on cold stone floors, while leftover wine was poured into chipped bowls and hard bread scraped from silver plates. The hosts smiled for the clergy. Priests nodded with approval. And then the children were told to leave, quietly, quickly, before their presence spoiled the air. The smallest orphans were sometimes placed at the gates of churches during services, not because it fed them, but because it reminded parishioners of their duty. A noble might toss a coin at a child without ever asking their name, without noticing the bruises on their legs or the sores on their feet. A baker might offer stale crusts before returning to count his profits. These weren't acts of kindness. They were transactions. I gave, they thought. Now God owes me peace. And it wasn't just about food or coins. Sometimes towns would build almshouses, small, grim stone structures where the sick, elderly, and orphaned were confined together. These buildings were not shelters. They were holding pens. But because they existed, the wealthy could tell themselves they had done their part, that the poor were being cared for. Even if that care amounted to moldy straw, shared rations, and a roof that leaked every time it rained. If you were an orphan, you learned quickly how to perform poverty, how to keep your voice low, how to bow just enough, how to look both grateful and invisible at the same time. If you failed at this performance, if you looked too healthy, too bold, too alive, you were accused of faking, of taking more than you deserved, because in a society built on guilt-based charity, the orphan's job was never to be saved. It was to justify the giver's comfort. In a world starved for meaning and riddled with suffering, the church clung tightly to tales of divine intervention, and sometimes the very orphans it ignored in life were transformed into saints in death, their misery repackaged as miracles, their tragedies rewritten as tales of virtue. And so began a twisted tradition: the orphan martyr, the holy child, the pure soul who suffered so perfectly they must have been chosen by God. A child dies in the street, and within a month, rumors swirl. They were always kind. They never complained. They saw angels in their dreams. One claimed the child healed a sick dog. Another said they saw a halo during their final breath. Before long, the church took notice, not because it wanted to honor the child, but because miracles attracted pilgrims, and pilgrims brought money. Relics were invented: a torn sandal, a wooden bowl, a piece of cloth stained with tears. Stories were written and copied, exaggerated, dramatized. The child who was beaten to death became a holy sacrifice. The girl who starved in the snow became a vision of divine endurance. Never mind that no one fed her while she lived. Now she was useful. These miracle tales served a purpose. They inspired donations, reinforced church doctrine, and reminded everyone to accept their suffering in silence. After all, if a starving orphan could achieve sainthood through pain, couldn't you endure a little hardship too? Sometimes, entire towns would elevate an orphan child to near mythic status. A shrine built over the place where they died, a candle lit in their name, a sermon preached about their innocence. But the stories always glossed over the cruelty. No mention of the abuse, the hunger, the indifference. Just the clean, sanitized version, one that made the faithful weep without forcing them to confront the society that let the child die in the first place. And the living orphans? They watched this unfold with hollow eyes. They knew the truth, that the only way anyone ever paid attention was if you suffered so completely, so poetically, that you became useful in death. It was a cruel irony. The more pitiful your end, the more holy your memory. No one asked whether the orphan would have preferred a warm meal over a stained glass window, whether they might have chosen to live in obscurity rather than die in sanctity. Because once they were gone, their story wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the church, to the town, to the myth. And thus, the miracle tales endured, not because they saved orphans, but because they made everyone else feel better about not doing so. In a world where orphans died unseen, it was the rare few who were remembered, and the even rarer few who were turned into symbols. The sainted dead child became a convenient image. The pure soul, the innocent martyr, the spotless lamb who suffered so gracefully that their story could be used to inspire others. But behind every sainted tale was a corpse that had once begged, once bled, once trembled in the cold. And no miracle rewrote what really happened. These children were turned into legends, but only after they'd endured the worst. A girl who died of fever after fasting too long became an icon of piety. A boy who froze in the chapel doorway became a lesson in humility. Their deaths, which had once been preventable, were suddenly meaningful. Their pain, which had been ignored, was rebranded as virtuous, and the people who had passed them by in life now bowed before their stories. The church painted halos over their heads, Artists illustrated them surrounded by light, angels, and awe. Pilgrims came to touch the ground where they died. Coins dropped into alms boxes. Candles were lit. But no one wanted the truth. That the child had starved. That they had cried for help. That their last breath came not in glory, but in silence, beneath a sky that didn't blink. These sainted stories served a purpose. They soothed the guilt of the powerful. We didn't neglect her, they could say. We gave her a shrine. We didn't fail him, they insisted. He's a symbol now. But sainthood didn't bring back the stolen days, the mornings that could have been filled with laughter, the nights that could have ended in lullabies instead of loneliness. These children were not saints. They were survivors who didn't survive. And those who were left behind, the living orphans, learned something cruel. That the world might remember you, but only if your suffering could be packaged. Only if your story could be told from a pulpit. Only if your death could teach a lesson someone else wanted to hear. Until then, you remained invisible. Too dirty to pray beside. Too poor to name. Too alive to matter. So you watched as they lifted the dead child's name. As they built chapels and carved statues and sang hymns. You knelt like everyone else, not in reverence, but in fear, because now you knew the truth. You might only be seen when you were too broken to save, and by then, all you'd have left was the echo of your name, twisted into something holy, but never whole. For orphans, even innocence was suspicious. You didn't have a family name. You didn't have a father to speak for you or a mother to plead your case, which meant the smallest misstep, a stolen turnip, a dirty look, a broken tool, could be branded as a crime, and in medieval Europe, crime was punished not privately but publicly. Pain wasn't just a consequence, it was a performance. You were dragged through the square, not because you were dangerous, but because others needed to see what happened to those who stepped out of line. A boy caught sleeping in the wrong barn, tied to the post. A girl found with a crust of bread she didn't earn, whipped in the market. And no one stopped to ask what brought you there. They assumed you were guilty because you were poor. Children weren't spared from punishment. In fact, they were often targeted for it. You couldn't pay a fine, so you were beaten instead. You couldn't hire an advocate, so you were judged on sight. And when the lash came down or the stocks clamped shut, the crowd would gather, not with pity, but with satisfaction. This will teach them, they said. This will keep them honest. Sometimes you were branded. A burn on your hand. A mark behind your ear. Thief, it meant. Liar. And that mark followed you forever. No one would hire you. No one would help you. One mistake at 8 years old became a life sentence. You weren't just punished. You were identified as broken, stained, a walking warning. In some towns, the humiliation was more elaborate. You might be forced to wear a sign, made to sing your sins aloud, tied beside livestock and mocked as animals passed you by. All while the adults who were supposed to protect children stood in silence, or worse, cheered. What they never asked was why. Why were you sleeping in that barn? Why did you take that crust? Why did you snap, scream, strike out? They never asked, because they didn't care. In their eyes, you weren't a child. You were a problem, a flaw in their peaceful illusion, a weed that needed to be pulled, not watered. So you learned to keep your head down, to avoid markets, to sleep in shadows, to walk with your hands hidden and your back pressed to walls. Not because you were a criminal, but because in a world ruled by fear and spectacle, being poor was already a crime, and being a child made it easier to punish. In the Middle Ages, winter wasn't poetic. It wasn't a silent snowfall outside a candlelit window. It was a slow, merciless executioner. And for orphans, alone, exposed and forgotten, it was often the final chapter. If summer was hunger, winter was hunger plus frostbite, infection plus darkness, cold that crept into your bones and never left. There were no insulated homes, no wool-lined coats, no warm beds, just stone buildings that leaked wind like sieves, straw bedding stiff with old sweat and animal droppings, and clothing that hadn't been dry since autumn. Your tunic, if you still had one, was crusted with filth and too thin to stop the chill. Your shoes, if you'd ever owned them, were long gone. Bare feet on frozen ground became normal. Sores turned to ulcers. Fingers turned black. And once your blood stopped moving, it didn't start again. The fire in the hearth? That belonged to the master, the lady, the priest. You could warm your hands if you were allowed inside. If not, you curled near ashes, scavenged old coals, or tried to bury yourself in hay that stank of animals and mold. But you didn't complain. Complaining got you kicked, or worse, sent back out. Food was scarcer than ever. Crops were long dead. Supplies were hoarded. The bread, if it came at all, was gray and sour, hard enough to chip a tooth. Water was ice, and cooking fires were too costly to waste on an orphan's hunger. You ate what was left after everyone else, usually nothing. Sickness ran rampant in the cold. Coughs echoed through halls. Fevers smoldered. Death came quietly, breath by breath, under thin blankets and colder ceilings. When you saw another child stop shivering, you knew what it meant. And the worst part? No one acted surprised. Death in winter was expected, almost accepted, like bad weather or spoiled milk. If you were on the streets, it was worse. You wandered in circles to stay warm, slept under carts, huddled with other orphans like dying birds. You traded everything for warmth, shoes, dignity, hope. Some lit scraps of parchment, risking fire for 10 seconds of heat. Some didn't wake up at all. When a child froze to death, their body was stiff by dawn, carried out like trash. No mourning, just disposal. The town moved on. The workhouse took in another. The streets swallowed another name, and the cold never noticed, because the cold didn't care. Winter didn't come with fanfare. It came with silence, and for orphans, that silence was louder than any scream. There were wolves in the forests, real ones, with yellow eyes and silent paws, stalking through the trees on winter nights. But the wolves that truly haunted orphans didn't wear fur. They wore smiles, robes, armor. They lived in towns, in houses, in churches. And unlike the creatures in the woods, these wolves didn't hide. They waited. For a child with no protection, no voice, and no one to notice if they vanished, the world was full of predators. A kind word could be a trap. A soft hand could be a leash. The merchant who offered you a warm place to sleep? He might be buying more than your labor. The guards who claimed to keep order? They might simply move you along to protect someone else's secret. No one taught you who to fear. You learned by surviving. You knew to step carefully around drunk men in alleys, to keep distance from priests who smiled too much, to never sleep too deeply near unfamiliar travelers. Other children warned you in whispers. Sometimes a girl went missing. Sometimes a boy came back with bruises and dead eyes. You didn't ask. You just learned. These human wolves were drawn to desperation, to hunger, to cold, because that's when you said yes. Yes, I'll follow you. Yes, I'll carry that load. Yes, I'll do what you ask, just please, please, give me bread, give me fire, give me shelter. And once you said yes, you stopped being a child. You became a possession, something to be used, then discarded. The worst predators didn't just steal your body, they stole your silence. They convinced you it was your fault, that no one would believe you, that you were lucky they didn't do worse. And for most orphans, those words sank deep. You carried the shame long after the bruises faded, long after the wolf moved on to another, newer child. And still, everyone pretended not to see, because acknowledging you meant acknowledging what had been done. It was easier to label you trouble, a liar, a seducer, a demon in the body of a child. So the wolves stayed fed, and the orphans stayed hunted. Not every danger wore claws. Sometimes it wore a friendly face. And for orphans in the Middle Ages, the world was full of wolves, and none of them howled at the moon. There's a myth that medieval orphans were always passive, bowed heads, soft footsteps, empty eyes. But some fought back, not because they were brave, but because they had nothing left to lose. You can only be kicked so many times before you bite. And for a child with no family, no food, no name, the moment you fought back was the moment you stopped being afraid and started being dangerous. You didn't have swords or shields. You had rocks, nails, stolen knives with broken handles. You had fists, teeth, and rage that never cooled. Some orphans learned to punch before they learned to pray, because prayer didn't stop bullies. It didn't scare off drunkards in alleys. It didn't save your friends when they were dragged off in the dark. Street gangs of children weren't myths. They were survival. Packs of orphans formed not to rule, but to last. You watched each other's backs, shared what little you stole, and took revenge when one of yours was hurt. Maybe you couldn't bring them back, but you could make someone bleed. And sometimes that was enough to sleep without shaking. You scratched, clawed, and broke fingers. You fought older boys, thieving guards, shopkeepers who kicked you one too many times. You didn't win because you were stronger. You won because you had to. Losing meant hunger. It meant pain. It meant vanishing. And you weren't ready to vanish yet. Not every orphan used violence. Some used words like blades. Some lied. Some bartered. Some poisoned. You did what you had to do. What you weren't allowed to do was stay quiet when survival required sound. You screamed. You spit. You refused. And sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. But the world didn't like orphans who fought back. They were labeled monsters, possessed, demonic. Girls who bit and scratched were called witches. Boys who struck were branded thieves before they ever stole. The system didn't punish the violence that created you. It punished your reaction to it. Still, you kept going, because sometimes the only power you had was the decision to throw a punch, to scream in the face of a man who expected silence, to spit blood and keep standing. You weren't trying to be a hero. You were trying to be alive. And in a world that demanded your submission, your fight was the loudest way you could say, "I matter." If you were poor and parentless in medieval times, war wasn't something that happened far away. It was a knock at the door, a shout in the street, a conscription that didn't ask your age. War didn't care if you were 12. If you could carry a blade or even just a bucket, you were useful. And so orphans were dragged into battle, not as soldiers, but as fodder. Some were recruited outright. Lords needed bodies. Knights needed squires. Armies needed water carriers, messengers, cooks. If you were small and quick, They strapped a bag of supplies to your back and sent you through arrows. If you slowed down, you died. If you didn't come back, no one asked why. Other orphans volunteered, not for honor, not for glory, but because armies fed their men. Sometimes they clothed them, sometimes. And for a child who had nothing, even a rotten crust and a tattered tunic sounded like mercy. You weren't naive. You just didn't want to starve. And if you picked up a sword, even worse. You weren't trained. You weren't strong. You were thrown into the fight to fill the gap left by dying men. If you died, they'd replace you. If you survived, they might promote you. From cannon fodder to banner carrier. A child waving a flag above a field of corpses. Wounds were frequent. Medical care was a joke. A gash could kill you. An infection could rot you from the inside out. And if you tried to leave, you were branded a deserter, punishable by death. Even though no one had ever asked you to join in the first place. Some orphans were used as spies. Who would suspect a barefoot boy? Who'd question a starving girl slipping through the gates? You were sent to listen, to steal, to sabotage. And when you were caught, no one ransomed you. No one negotiated. You were hanged, tortured, tossed in a ditch. War didn't give orphans purpose. It gave them a new kind of suffering, a new way to die, a new set of orders shouted by men who saw them as tools, not children. And the worst part? When the war ended, you didn't come home, because you had no home. The army marched on. The fields were burned. And the only reward was that you were still breathing, if barely. To the world, you were brave. To history, you were invisible. And to yourself, you were just one more orphan in armor too big, holding a weapon too heavy, praying for peace that never came. For orphaned girls in medieval times, the convent was often painted as a refuge, a quiet place of prayer, learning, and protection. But the truth was more complicated. The convent wasn't a sanctuary. It was a solution to a problem society didn't want to face: what to do with unwanted girls. If you were poor, unmarried, too young, too old, too mouthy, or just inconvenient, the church might take you in. But it didn't take you in with open arms. It took you with folded hands and closed doors. You didn't choose the veil. It was chosen for you. You were sent by lords trying to save face, by parishes looking to clean their ledgers, by distant cousins who didn't want your mouth to feed. And once you entered, your old life vanished. Your clothes, your name, sometimes even your hair. You were given a new identity, sister this or that, and expected to be grateful. No voice, no opinion, just obedience wrapped in wool. The convents were cold, the walls thick with silence, rules etched into every brick. You rose before dawn, chanted until your throat ached, and worked until your back screamed. You copied manuscripts by candlelight, spun wool with frozen fingers, grew herbs you rarely got to taste. Meals were small, beds were smaller, joy was not encouraged. Discipline, however, was ever present. A glance too long, a prayer forgotten, a mistake in the kitchen, and you were corrected. With words, with isolation, sometimes with the rod. For girls who had survived violence, the convent might have felt safer. For a while, until they realized they'd simply traded one form of control for another. You weren't a servant now. You were a vessel for duty, for doctrine, for sacrifice. If you didn't believe, you faked it, because doubt was dangerous, and those who whispered questions often found themselves isolated, spiritually or physically. There was no leaving. Once you took vows, or had them taken for you, you were bound. You could be punished for trying to leave, disgraced, branded a heretic or worse. Your entire life was scripted before it had even begun. You prayed when told, fasted when told, smiled when told. And if you cried, you did it quietly in the chapel, where even God seemed to echo back with silence. Yes, some women found peace in the convent. Some built gardens, taught the next generation, even wrote music and texts that defied the centuries. But orphan girls rarely got that far. Most were seen as labor, as mouths to shut, as burdens that had been redirected into stone cloisters and candlelit silence. So while the world called it holy, you knew better. You hadn't been saved. You'd been put away. In a world terrified of the unknown, someone always had to take the blame. And when crops failed, or cows died, or storms struck too soon, towns needed a culprit. Someone weak. Someone voiceless. Someone the community wouldn't miss. And time after time, orphans, especially girls, fit that need perfectly. You were already different, already marked. You had no father to defend you, no mother to swear to your innocence. You wandered, you listened, you survived things others didn't. And, in a superstitious world, survival without explanation was suspicious. If you didn't starve, if you didn't freeze, if you knew which herbs could soothe pain, people didn't call it wisdom. They called it witchcraft. The accusations didn't come with logic, they came with fear. A widow fell ill? Maybe you cursed her. A goat miscarried? Maybe your touch caused it. Someone dreamt of fire and woke to find you in their doorway. That was enough. You were accused. And once accused, there was no escape. The tests were cruel. They'd throw you in water, tied to a stone. If you sank, you were innocent, but dead. If you floated, you were guilty and condemned. They burned herbs under your feet to smoke the truth out. They forced you to confess while bound, starved, sleep-deprived. They poked you with needles, searching for the devil's mark. A mole, a scar, a birthmark, anything could be proof. And sometimes they didn't even test, they just pointed. And the crowd followed, because fear moves faster than mercy. And an orphan girl accused of witchcraft? She was already alone, no family to vouch for her, no wealth to bribe the judge, just trembling hands and hollow eyes. If you were lucky, you were exiled, sent into the woods to die. If not, you were hanged, or burned, or stoned. The town watched. The priest blessed it. And then everyone went home and slept easier, convinced they had protected themselves from evil. But the truth was crueler. You weren't a witch. You were just visible. Too visible. Too strange. Too easy to single out in a world that needed enemies more than it needed justice. And the next morning, when the fire was out and the ashes swept clean, no one remembered your name. Only the smoke that lingered, and the silence that followed. In medieval society, helping the poor wasn't just a virtue. It was a social currency. Towns that gave to the needy were praised. Churches that fed the hungry were admired. But behind the sermons and charity fairs, there was another motive: taxes. More specifically, how to justify them. The orphan became a symbol, a reason to collect, to redirect, to appear generous. And in this twisted system, your suffering wasn't a problem. It was a useful problem. When lords or bishops wanted to raise a local tithe or church tax, they often pointed to the poor, especially orphans, as their cause. "Look at these starving children," they'd say, gesturing toward a handful of gaunt figures brought forward for effect. Surely we must help them. And coins flowed, not always into the orphan's hands, but into the coffers that claimed to protect them. The church would cite holy obligation. The towns would promise better poorhouses. Guilds would boast of taking in apprentices. But most of it was a performance, a tax justification. Because the image of the orphan, the tear-streaked face, the threadbare tunic, the trembling hands, was profitable. You became the poster child of pity, while the people in power collected coins on your behalf and kept most of them. Sometimes they built something, a new workhouse, a soup station that operated once a week, a plaque with the names of donors in gold. But day after day, your stomach still growled. You were still sleeping on straw, still sharing lice with 6 others. The help they spoke of in sermons never reached your hands. It stopped just short, stuck in ledgers, draped in ribbons, paraded at festivals. And if anyone questioned it, if someone asked where the money went, they were reminded of the good already done. Didn't we save that one boy, the one who now sweeps for the monastery? Didn't we provide cloaks last winter? One child helped became the excuse for the 10 who were not. A single success story became a shield against scrutiny. Orphans weren't helped because they were children. They were helped because they made for good headlines. In a society that feared bad harvests and angry gods, almsgiving was damage control. And your misery made the system look holy. You were the justification for someone else's virtue, and the currency in someone else's ledger. But rarely, if ever, were you the one who got paid. Not all cruelty came from indifference, and not all kindness came from power. Sometimes, in the cracks between the systems that failed orphans, a hand reached out, not from a priest or noble, but from a peasant, a farmer with little more than turnips to give, a widow with more grief than grain, a laborer who knew hunger too well to ignore someone smaller feeling the same. The peasants were poor. Their lives were brutal, but they understood pain, and though they had barely enough for their own, there were moments, small, quiet, human moments, when they gave anyway. A crust of bread left on a doorstep, a wool scrap sewn into a scarf, a child pulled into a hayloft during a storm, no words spoken, just shelter offered. This wasn't charity. It wasn't grand. It wasn't always safe. Peasants who helped orphans could be punished, fined for harboring vagrants, scolded for feeding theft-prone. Some towns even passed laws forbidding peasants from aiding street children, fearing it encouraged laziness or drew more mouths to feed. But they did it anyway, not because of law, because of memory. Many peasants had been orphans once, or had siblings who died young, or knew what it meant to be alone in the wind, praying for a door to open. So they opened theirs, just a crack, long enough to warm frozen fingers, to share broth, to press a kiss to a lice-ridden head and whisper a blessing in the dark. It wasn't enough to change your life, but it was enough to remember that not everyone wanted you to disappear, enough to believe that not every adult would hurt you, enough to keep going one more day. And sometimes those moments stretched into something bigger. A peasant family might take a child in, unofficially, illegally, no documents, just a place by the fire and work shared among hands too small but too eager to be left outside. You didn't become a son or daughter, but maybe you became ours. These acts didn't erase the pain, but they softened it, reminded you that while the church counted coins and nobles drafted ledgers, kindness still lived in the dirt. It wore rough clothes. It spoke in hushed voices. It smelled of goats and boiled onions, but it was real. And for an orphan with nothing, a real act of kindness was worth more than all the gold the cathedral kept behind its locked doors. If you made it to adolescence as a medieval orphan, you were already a survivor. Not in the inspirational storybook way, but in the raw, skeletal, scarred-by-life way. Childhood didn't end with a celebration. It ended when you stopped flinching at raised voices, when your body had learned to ignore hunger, when your voice shrank to fit the silence people expected from you. You didn't grow up. You aged through trauma, rapidly, quietly, reluctantly. By your early teens, your eyes looked older than most elders. Your joints cracked from years of kneeling, hauling, crouching in the cold. If you were lucky enough to avoid disease, punishment, and war, your reward was labor, endless labor. You were expected to pull your weight, often literally, alongside adults who forgot you were still a child. Girls became mothers, sometimes without consent. Boys were expected to carry iron, dig graves, or ride out with levied soldiers who barely knew their names. You weren't too young for anything anymore. No one cared about your past. You had made it this far. That was supposed to be enough. Gratitude was expected, even as your bones ached and your hope thinned. And yet, even survival came with a cost. Emotionally, you were hollowed. Trust was a luxury. Joy felt suspicious. Smiling too wide could be seen as mockery. You watched your back at every meal, slept lightly, even in relative safety. Friends had disappeared too often. Helpers had turned cruel too quickly. You kept your guard up, because dropping it even once had cost others everything. No one celebrated your resilience. No one marked your survival with feasts or blessings. Instead, they handed you new burdens. If you could lift a scythe, you were sent to the fields. If you could hold a pail, you fetched water until your fingers bled. If you could stay quiet, you were put in rooms where silence was currency. Your reward for living was simply more life, with all its weight, all its wounds, and none of the recognition. And through it all, you remembered the others, the ones who didn't survive, the girl who died in her sleep, the boy who vanished in winter, the baby buried nameless at the edge of the monastery grounds. You carried their absence with you, not as inspiration, but as warning. Because you knew this truth better than most. Living didn't mean you had won. It only meant you hadn't been broken yet. The medieval world was built on records, land titles, tax rolls, royal births, guild rosters. But nowhere in those ledgers, nowhere in the parchment-stacked halls of power, was there a place for you. Orphans weren't counted. Not really, not consistently, not humanely. You existed in whispers, in margins, in the notes of priests too tired to remember your name. You were part of the population, but not part of the story. The census, when it happened, was for the living who mattered. Those who held property, paid tithes, bred heirs. If you didn't own land, you were reduced to a number. If you didn't have a family name, you were reduced to nothing, or worse, recorded simply as a boy, a servant, an unnamed girl. You were a ghost in ink, a shadow in records. And once you were gone, so was your trace. Sometimes, monks kept lists of the orphans under their care, but those lists weren't about identity. They were about inventory. How many mouths to feed? How many sets of clothes needed? How many could be sent to work? You were not Thomas, born under a red moon. You were child 7, girl, aged 9, small and silent. Even your death might be summed in a single line, expired from cold. No location, no grief. Just a tick in a box that no one would ever look at again. And the irony? Towns bragged about how many poor they helped, how many orphans they saved. But when asked for proof, they came up empty. They remembered numbers, not names. Good deeds, not lives. The only thing they remembered about you was that you had once been hungry and made their ledgers look merciful. As centuries passed, historians pored over charters and birth rolls, trying to reconstruct the past. They found knights, nobles, bishops. They found thieves, kings, and traitors. But they rarely found you. Your story existed only in implication, in the silence between records, in the gap where a child should have been listed but wasn't. You weren't forgotten because you were unimportant. You were forgotten because remembering you never benefited anyone. Because to remember would be to admit. Admit how many of you died nameless. How many were used and discarded. How many lives slipped through the cracks while the church counted relics and the kings counted coin. And so the orphan drifted through time, undocumented, unseen. Present in every town, every village, every war, and yet invisible to history, until now. Every era has its heroes, its poets, its chronicles etched in stone or copied on parchment, kings who conquered, knights who died gloriously, saints who spoke with angels. But the orphan's story, the real one, the quiet one, the horrifyingly common one, wasn't told. Not because it lacked meaning, but because it lacked witnesses. And in the Middle Ages, if no one saw you, you never existed. Your days were filled with events worthy of remembrance. The first time you survived a winter. The first time you stole and got away. The first time someone called you daughter or son, even for a moment. But no bard sang of that. No monk inked it into history. You weren't the kind of character they built ballads around. You were the shadow in the background of someone else's epic. The few stories that were told about orphans were fictional. Moral lessons, parables, children who obeyed and were rewarded, orphans who repented and were saved. They weren't real depictions. They were tools, designed to teach the rich a lesson, to manipulate guilt, to decorate the pulpit. And always, the orphan in these stories was quiet, passive, sweet, never angry, never complicated. But you were never passive. You were starving, furious, brave. You risked everything just to see another sunrise. You carried pain like armor and still dared to hope, once in a while, for warmth. But no one wrote that down. Because your truth didn't comfort people. It shamed them. So they turned away and wrote something else instead. How many girls died unnamed in convents? How many boys were buried beneath the gallows tree? How many acts of kindness were given between orphans with nothing to offer but crumbs and shelter? All lost, gone with the wind, the paper, the fire, because no one thought your story mattered enough to preserve. And yet, here you are now, still lingering in the bones beneath old churches, in the ruins of forgotten poorhouses, in the faces of modern children whose names still fall through cracks. You were never given a voice then, but your absence left an echo, and that echo is louder than anyone expected. In the medieval world, a name was everything. It wasn't just how people called you, it was how the world recognized you. Names were recorded in ledgers, etched into gravestones, whispered in church during prayer. A name tied you to a family, a village, a lineage. It meant you belonged. It meant someone had claimed you. But if you were an orphan, you often had no such anchor. You might be called boy, girl, that one, or simply you. Some were named after saints, others after days of the week they were found. Many were given a name once, only to have it stripped changed, or forgotten the next time they were sold or relocated. Without a name, you couldn't inherit land. You couldn't prove anything. You couldn't even be buried properly. The priest needed a name to say the final rites. The grave digger needed one to chisel a stone. Without it, you were dust before you died. And even when you had a name, it was often used against you, written into workhouse records like cattle tags, called out during punishment, whispered cruelly by masters who made sure you never forgot that you were alone. A name should have been a beginning, but for orphans, it was often just a label for the burden you carried. You saw other children with full names: Robert of Lothbury, Isabel of the South End. Names that meant history, roots, memory. You had none of that. No of, no claim. You could disappear tomorrow, and the world would go on untouched, unmoved, because no one could say, "That one was mine." And still, you held on to the sound of your name, whatever it was. Even if you gave it to yourself, even if you whispered it into straw at night, reminding the dark that you existed, because names are power. And you deserved to be more than the boy who worked the mill, or that girl from the gutter. You deserved to be known. In the end, the cost of a name wasn't just social. It was spiritual. In a world ruled by the church, salvation came to those whose names were spoken. If your name wasn't on a scroll, in a prayer, or remembered by the living, then maybe your soul too would be forgotten. And that, more than death, was the greatest fear of all, to leave the world as you had lived in it, nameless. Death was easy to understand. You stopped breathing. People wept, sometimes. A grave was dug, if you were lucky, and life moved on. But invisibility? That was slower, quieter, meaner. For orphans in the Middle Ages, you didn't have to die to disappear. You just had to exist in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with nothing to offer. You were the child everyone stepped around, the one they didn't make eye contact with. You stood beside church steps, market stalls, manor gates, and no one looked down. It wasn't that they hated you, they just didn't see you. Not really. Not as a person. You were background, scenery. A whisper they chose to ignore. You lived, but not in anyone's mind. You could scream and still be ignored. Cry, and they'd hear wind. You worked, you served, you scraped by. But unless someone needed a moral lesson or a cheap laborer, you were air. You were absence. You were a life waiting to be acknowledged, even when you did everything right, worked hard, stayed quiet, obeyed. You weren't rewarded. You were tolerated, just enough to be kept around, but never quite enough to be remembered. They might know your face, maybe your job, but never your story, never your dreams. You had no future people cared to ask about, no legacy anyone hoped to see fulfilled. And so, like many orphans, you adapted. You wore invisibility like armor. You used it to steal, to slip past guards, to sleep in places others feared. You learned how to walk silently, speak carefully, and vanish when danger was near. You survived because they didn't see you, but you also suffered because they never chose to. You lived a ghost's life while your heart still beat. And when it finally stopped, whether by blade, by fever, or simply by time, no one lit a candle. No one said a name. Because by then, you'd already been gone a long time, not dead, just invisible. Surviving orphanhood in the Middle Ages didn't end the story. It marked it, like a brand, like a wound that scabbed over but never fully healed. You could grow taller, stronger, wiser. You could learn a trade, gain a roof, maybe even be called useful. But the world never forgot where you started, and neither did you. Because orphanhood in that time wasn't a phase. It was a sentence, a permanent condition stamped into your soul. You carried it everywhere, in the way you lowered your eyes in noble company, in the way you flinched at laughter, unsure if it mocked you, in the way you apologized for asking too much, too loud, too soon. Even if you found work, or marriage, or sanctuary, there was always a wall, not made of stone, but of memory. You remembered the cold nights, the silence after a friend died, the sound of your own stomach grinding against emptiness. You remembered what it meant to be disposable, and no kindness, not even real love, could fully erase that truth. Others noticed it too. They'd ask where you were from, and you'd lie, because saying, "I don't know," was like saying, "I was no one." You'd be told to be grateful, for bread, for shelter, for being allowed to exist. But gratitude doesn't come easy when you've built your identity from loss, from absence, from clawing your way through a world that labeled you less than human. And when you finally aged, gray hair, cracked hands, bones worn from decades of quiet labor, you still heard the whisper in your head. You were the one no one wanted. Even surrounded by people, the orphaned child in you never stopped looking for safety, for belonging, for someone to say, "You matter," not because of what you do, but because of who you are. But in the Middle Ages, that rarely came. Orphanhood wasn't something you survived. It was something you carried, to your last breath, and sometimes even beyond it.